The question was not asked with malice. That was the worst of it. Lord Pelham's dining room held 42 that evening. The long table dressed in white damask beneath 3 chandeliers whose candles had been lit an hour before the first carriage arrived, and the conversation had turned, as it always did at such gatherings, to the comfortable inventory of who was where and with whom. Lady Torrance, seated to Conrad's left, had simply inquired after the Duchess. A polite question. The kind one asks between the second and third courses, when the fish has been cleared and the roast has not yet arrived. Conrad Ashby, Duke of Welling, set down his wine-glass and regarded the question as one might regard a bill of lading for goods one had forgotten ordering. "I have forgotten her name," he said. He did not smile when he said it. He did not pause for effect. He reached for his glass again and drank, and in the motion of drinking, dismissed not only the question, but the entire category of thought to which it belonged. His wife. Yes, he had one. She was somewhere, the estate presumably, or her father's house in Hertfordshire. He had not given the matter sufficient attention to be certain. The season was underway, and he had been in London for 3 weeks, attending to his seat in the House of Lords, dining at his club, and existing in the comfortable amnesia of a man whose domestic arrangements required nothing of him. Lady Torrance's expression did not change. She was 63 years old and had survived 4 decades of London society by developing a face that revealed nothing until she had decided what a piece of information was worth. She lifted her own glass. She drank. She filed the remark in the place where she kept such things, a mental cabinet of extraordinary depth and meticulous organization, and she said, "How delightful," which was a word she used exclusively when she meant the opposite. The footman cleared Conrad's plate. Lord Pelham, at the head of the table, was discussing the new canal proposals with Sir Geoffrey Hale. The Countess of Marchfield was laughing at something the younger Pelham son had said. The evening was proceeding precisely as such evenings proceed. 30 or 40 people of rank and connection performing the elaborate ritual of dining together while the real business of observation, assessment, and gentle destruction carried on beneath the surface like water under ice. The butler appeared at the far end of the room. He was an old man named Jessup who had served the Pelham household for 31 years and who possessed the particular gift of announcing arrivals with a gravity that suggested each guest was a foreign dignitary arriving for the signing of a treaty. He stepped into the doorway. He waited for a seam in the conversation. Jessup always found the seam, and he spoke. The Duchess of Welling. The silence that followed was not immediate. It arrived in stages, spreading outward from those nearest the door like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. Lady Torrance heard it first. Her glass stopped halfway to her lips. Lord Pelham looked up from his canal discussion. The Countess of Marchfield turned in her chair. And Conrad, who had been reaching for the salt cellar with the unhurried confidence of a man whose evening contained no surprises, felt the air in the room change before he understood why. She stood in the doorway. Vivian Ashby wore a gown of pale silver-gray silk that caught the candlelight along its folds like water-catching moonlight. Her dark hair was dressed simply, a few strands arranged to frame her face, the rest gathered at the nape of her neck with a single ivory comb that had belonged to her mother. She carried no fan. She wore no jewels save her wedding ring and a pair of small pearl earrings that had been a gift from Conrad's grandmother on the occasion of their marriage 3 years ago, in a ceremony he had attended with the dutiful indifference of a man signing a lease. She stood in the doorway and she looked at the room, and the room looked back at her, and neither flinched. She crossed the floor. Her pace was unhurried. Her expression held the precise warmth of a woman arriving at a dinner to which she had been invited and at which she was welcome. Nothing more, nothing less, nothing that could be read as awareness that anything had been said, nothing that could be interpreted as performance. She moved between the chairs with the ease of someone who understood the geometry of a crowded dining room and did not need to think about it. She reached her husband. "Conrad," she said, and her voice was warm and clear and held not a single frequency that did not belong there. She touched his arm, briefly with the tips of her gloved fingers, and smiled at him with the composed affection of a wife greeting her husband in public. "Forgive my lateness. The roads from Hertfordshire were abominable." He stood. Of course he stood. Every man at the table stood when a duchess entered the room, and Conrad was nothing if not a man who understood the mechanics of public behavior. He stood and he looked at her, and for a fraction of a second, so brief that only Lady Torrance caught it, because Lady Torrance caught everything, something moved behind his eyes that might have been recognition. Not of her face, of the distance between what he had said and where she now stood. Vivian, he said, her name. The name he had 30 seconds earlier, claimed to have forgotten. Lord Pelham was already on his feet, crossing toward them with the practiced warmth of a host who understood that the evening had just acquired its central event. "Duchess, what a magnificent surprise. We shall have another place set immediately. Jessup, another setting beside the Duke, if you please." He took her hand and bowed over it, and his eyes, when he straightened, held the particular brightness of a man who had just been given a gift he had not expected and intended to enjoy thoroughly. A chair appeared. A place was laid with the swift precision that characterized Lord Pelham's household. Plate, glass, silver, napkin, all materializing as though they had been waiting in the wings for exactly this entrance. Vivian sat. She arranged her napkin. She accepted a glass of wine from the footman with a small nod of thanks that included, somehow, the footman himself, not merely his function, but his person, and she turned to the gentleman on her right, who happened to be Sir Geoffrey Hale, and asked him about the canal proposals with the informed interest of a woman who had read the relevant parliamentary reports and formed her own conclusions. The dinner resumed, but it did not resume as it had been. Something had shifted in the room, a redistribution of weight, as when a painting is rehung and the entire wall changes character. Lady Torrance watched from her position on Conrad's left and said nothing. She did not need to speak. She simply watched. The Countess of Marchfield leaned toward Mrs. Dalrymple and murmured something behind her fan. Mrs. Dalrymple's eyebrows rose 1/4 of an inch, the maximum permitted by good breeding, and she murmured something back. The younger Pelham son, who was 23 and not yet skilled at concealing his reactions, stared openly at the Duchess for a full 10 seconds before his mother caught his eye and he returned to his soup. Vivian was, Conrad observed with the dawning discomfort of a man watching a language he did not speak being spoken fluently by someone he had underestimated, extraordinary. She spoke with Sir Geoffrey about the canals and knew the engineering concerns. She spoke with Lady Marchfield about the new exhibition at the Royal Academy and had opinions that were her own, not borrowed from the Morning Post. She spoke with Lord Pelham about his gardens. She had visited Pelham Hall once 3 years ago, shortly after her marriage, and she remembered the particular rose varieties along the South Walk and inquired after the new glasshouse with a specificity that delighted him. She spoke with everyone. She was warm without being effusive, knowledgeable without being ostentatious, witty without being cruel. She was, in short, the most accomplished woman at the table, and she accomplished it with such apparent ease that it took Conrad the better part of an hour to understand that he was sitting beside someone he did not know. He had married her because she was suitable. The Marsh family was old, not titled, but connected, respectable, the kind of family that had been producing competent wives for the aristocracy for 6 generations without ever producing a scandal. Her father had a house in Hertfordshire and an income sufficient to provide a reasonable dowry. She had been presented to Conrad at a ball during the season of 1810, and he had danced with her twice and found her unobjectionable. They had married in September. She had moved to Welling Park. She had managed the household with quiet efficiency, corresponding with Mrs. Crabbe about menus and linens, consulting with Linton about the tenant farms, overseeing the gardens through the head gardener with a steady hand that required no supervision. She had done everything that was expected of her and nothing that was not, and Conrad had received this competence the way one receives a well-functioning clock, with the assumption that it would continue to function and no curiosity whatsoever about its mechanism. He had not wondered what she read. He had not asked what she thought about the canals or the academy or the roses at Pelham Hall. He had not noticed that she knew the particular varieties along the South Walk, because she had walked them with attention and remembered them with precision, the way she remembered everything, not passively, not by accident, but because Vivian Marsh had been born with a mind that catalogued the world and found it interesting, and she had married a man who had never once asked her what was in the catalogue. Between the 3rd and 4th courses, Lord Pelham raised his glass to the table and proposed a toast to the evening's unexpected pleasure, the arrival of the Duchess, who had transformed what he had feared would be a dull Wednesday into an occasion worth remembering. The table raised their glasses. Vivian inclined her head with graceful modesty and said that Lord Pelham was too kind, and that the pleasure was entirely hers, and that she had been looking forward to his table since the last time she had sat at it, which had been too long ago. It was a perfect response, warm, deflecting, containing just enough personal detail to feel genuine without revealing anything at all. Conrad watched her deliver it and understood, with the particular shame of a man seeing craftsmanship he had failed to notice in his own house, that she had been this accomplished all along. He had simply never put her in a room where he was required to watch. The Countess of Marchfield asked Vivian about the gardens at Welling Park, which she had heard were much improved. Vivian spoke about the south border, the succession planting she had designed so that something was always in bloom from April through October, and about the walled kitchen garden, which now supplied the house and had surplus enough that Mrs. Crabbe sent baskets to the tenants every Friday. She spoke about it without pride, as one speaks about a thing that exists and functions and requires no commentary, and the Countess, who had spent £40,000 on her own gardens at Marchfield and still could not get the dahlias to overwinter, looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who has just discovered that someone else is doing effortlessly what she has been doing badly at great expense. The fourth course arrived. Vivian turned to Conrad and asked him, with the same warm composure she had shown all evening, whether he had attended Lord Castlereagh's reception on Tuesday. He had. She asked whether the Irish question had been raised. It had. She offered a brief observation about the land proposals that was so precisely informed that Conrad, who sat in the House of Lords and voted on such matters, found himself listening rather than speaking, a reversal so unfamiliar that he did not immediately recognize it for what it was. Lady Torrance watched this exchange with the particular satisfaction of a woman who understood that she was witnessing something that could not be repeated, only remembered. She had known many marriages in her 63 years. She had watched dukes and duchesses perform every variation of the marital drama, the betrayals, the reconciliations, the glacial courtesies, the private wars conducted through seating arrangements and guest lists. But she had never seen quite this. A woman who might or might not have heard the most dismissive sentence a husband could utter, conducting herself with such flawless composure that the question of whether she had heard it became unanswerable, and therefore permanent. It would hang in the air forever. Every person at that table who had heard Conrad's remark would spend the rest of the evening, and, Lady Torrance suspected, a considerable portion of the rest of their lives, trying to determine whether the Duchess of Welling knew what her husband had said. They would never find out. The dessert was served, a lemon syllabub that Lord Pelham's cook prepared with particular skill, and Vivian praised it with genuine pleasure and asked whether the lemons came from the Pelham glasshouse. They did. She and Lord Pelham discussed the cultivation of citrus in English glasshouses for several minutes, during which Conrad sat beside her in a silence that had changed character 3 times since the beginning of the evening. It had begun as the silence of a man with nothing to say. It had become the silence of a man who understood he had said too much. Now it was the silence of a man who was listening to his wife discuss lemons with their host and realizing, with the slow, horrible clarity of sunrise revealing damage after a storm, that she was remarkable. The evening ended as such evenings end. The ladies withdrew. The gentlemen remained for port and tobacco. Lord Pelham, who missed nothing, did not raise the subject of Conrad's earlier remark, but he watched the Duke across the table with the steady, unreadable gaze of a man forming a judgment he would keep to himself. The younger men discussed horses. Sir Geoffrey returned to the canals. Conrad drank his port and contributed where required and felt, for the first time in 3 years of marriage, the specific weight of his own negligence pressing against his chest like a hand. Sir Geoffrey, who had spent most of the dinner in conversation with the Duchess, leaned toward Conrad during a lull and said, with the blunt admiration of a man who valued competence above all things, "Your wife understands the gradient problem it devises better than half the committee, Welling. You might bring her to the next session. She would improve the discourse considerably." He meant it as a compliment. He could not have known that it landed like a blade, because Conrad sat on that committee and had never once mentioned it to Vivian, and she had found the reports and read them and formed conclusions superior to his own, and she had done this entirely without his knowledge or encouragement, the way she had done everything, alone, excellent, unseen. The gentlemen rejoined the ladies. Vivian was standing near the pianoforte with Mrs. Dalrymple, examining a volume of Haydn that lay open on the music stand. She was not performing. She had not been asked and would not have presumed. But she was discussing the sonata with the quiet authority of a woman who played well and thought about what she played. Conrad crossed the room toward her, and she turned and greeted him with the same warm, composed expression she had worn all evening. There was nothing in her face that he could read. There was nothing absent from her face that he could identify. She was simply Vivian, present, courteous, complete, and the completeness of her composure was the thing that undid him because it left him nowhere to stand. He could not apologize for a remark she might not have heard. He could not explain himself to a woman who had given no indication that an explanation was required. He was trapped in the amber of his own words, preserved precisely as he had spoken them, and she had sealed the amber shut by being so entirely herself that there was no crack through which he could reach. The carriage was called at 11:30. They descended the steps of Pelham House together, his hand at her elbow in the automatic courtesy of a husband guiding his wife across uneven ground. The footman opened the carriage door. Vivian gathered her skirts and stepped inside. Conrad followed. The door closed. The carriage moved. Inside, the single lamp cast a low amber light that carved their faces from the darkness in sharp relief. Vivian turned toward the window. London passed outside. The glow of street lamps on wet cobblestones, the distant sound of another carriage, the particular quiet of a city that had emptied its drawing rooms and was settling into the private hours. She watched it with the same attentive stillness she had brought to everything that evening, the conversation, the dinner, the music, the company, as though the passing city were another text she was reading with care and finding worthy of her attention. Conrad sat across from her. The space between them was no more than 3 feet, the width of a carriage, and it was the widest distance he had ever felt. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He had been a man of considerable fluency all his life, in the House of Lords, at his club, at every dinner table in London, and now, sitting across from his wife in the amber half-light of their own carriage, he could not find a single word that was adequate to the occasion. Because what could he say? "I remember your name. I've always known your name." These were lies, and they both knew it, or she knew it, or she did not, and the not knowing was worse than the knowing because it meant that his apology, if he offered one, might be the very thing that informed her of the offense. He was caught. He was perfectly, precisely, devastatingly caught, and the trap was not of her making. She had simply arrived. She had simply been herself. The universe had delivered the consequence, and she had accepted it with a composure so complete that it had become, in itself, the most eloquent reproach he had ever received. The carriage stopped. They had arrived at the townhouse in Grosvenor Square. The footman opened the door. Vivian stepped out and waited while Conrad descended beside her. They walked up the steps together. The door opened. Linton had waited up, as he always did when the Duke was expected, and they entered the hall, where a single candelabrum burned on the side table, and the house held the particular hush of a large establishment in which the servants had retired, and the rooms were waiting. Vivian removed her gloves. She set them on the hall table beside the candelabrum with the neat precision that characterized everything she did. She turned to Conrad. "Good night," she said, and she smiled, the same warm, steady, unreadable smile she had given him all evening. And she turned and walked up the staircase, and she did not look back. Conrad stood in the hall and listened to her footsteps on the stairs, measured, unhurried, each one placed with the same quiet certainty as the last, and when the sound of her door closing reached him from the floor above, he remained where he was for a long time. The candelabrum guttered. The house breathed its slow nocturnal breath around him. He stood in his own hall and understood, with the clarity that only arrives when it is too late to be useful, that he had been living beside a woman of extraordinary qualities for 3 years and had not once looked closely enough to see them, and that the room full of people who had watched him fail to recognize what he had was now in possession of a story about the Duke of Welling that would outlast him. He did not sleep that night. He sat in his study with a glass of brandy he did not drink and thought about lemons, about canals, about the particular way she had touched his arm when she arrived, briefly with the tips of her gloved fingers, and how that brief touch contained more genuine warmth than anything he had offered her in 3 years of marriage. He thought about Mrs. Crabb's letters, which arrived monthly from Welling Park with detailed accounts of the household that he skimmed and filed without reading. He thought about Linton's reports on the tenant farms, which Vivian reviewed and annotated before they reached him, her small, neat handwriting in the margins offering suggestions he had never noticed were hers. He thought about the gardens, which had been transformed during his absences into something visitors remarked upon, and which he had attributed to the gardener without once asking who had directed the work. He went to Welling Park the following week. He did not announce his arrival, which was unusual. He simply appeared, his carriage pulling into the drive on a Tuesday afternoon when the light was soft and golden and the gardens that Vivian had designed were in full bloom around the house like a living frame. Mrs. Crabb met him at the door with the carefully managed surprise of a housekeeper who had, in fact, received word from Linton in London 2 hours earlier and had prepared accordingly. She informed him that the Duchess was in the morning room reviewing the quarter's household accounts with Linton's deputy. He found her there. She was seated at the writing desk by the window, her hair loosely pinned, wearing a simple morning dress of pale blue muslin. A ledger lay open before her, and she was making notations with a steady hand, her pen moving with the practiced fluency of someone who had been managing these accounts for 3 years without assistance or recognition. She looked up when he entered. She did not appear surprised. She set down her pen and greeted him with the same composed warmth she had shown at Pelham's dinner, the warmth that was genuine but revealed nothing of what lay beneath it. "Conrad," she said, "you are early for the season." He sat down across from her. He did not know how to begin. He was a man who had spent his adult life in rooms where language was a tool of precision and power. The House of Lords, the negotiating table, the carefully calibrated exchanges of political life. And here, in his own morning room, facing his own wife, he was without resources. "I heard you speak about the canals at Pelham's," he said. She regarded him with mild interest. "Did you? You knew the engineering concerns, the gradient problems at Devizes." "I read the committee reports," she said. "They are published. Anyone may read them." "I sit on the committee," Conrad said. "I did not know you read the reports." A pause. The morning light moved across the desk between them, illuminating the open ledger and the neat columns of figures in her handwriting. "You did not ask," she said. There was no accusation in her voice. It was simply a statement of fact, delivered with the same precision she brought to everything. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the margins of Linton's reports, stacked on the corner of the desk, annotated in her hand. He looked at the view from the window, the south garden, which he now understood she had planned, the new plantings along the drive, which she had chosen, the restored tenant cottages visible in the distance, which she had advocated for in letters to Linton that Conrad had never read. "Vivian," he said. She waited. "I should like to know what else you read." It was not an apology. It was not a declaration. It was, perhaps, the first honest sentence he had spoken to her in 3 years, an admission framed as a question that he had failed to ask the most basic questions a husband could ask, and was now, belatedly and inadequately, beginning. She studied him for a moment. Whatever she saw in his face, whatever she read in the particular quality of his attention, which was different from any attention he had paid her before, she did not name it. She did not demand more. She did not punish him with the long catalogue of things he had failed to notice. She simply reached for the stack of committee reports and moved them to the center of the desk between them and said, "Shall we start with the poor laws? I have thoughts." They sat together in the morning room until the light changed. She spoke about the poor laws, and he listened. She spoke about the drainage problems on the eastern tenant farms, and he asked questions, real questions, not the performative inquiries of a man going through motions, but the genuine questions of someone who was hearing information for the first time and finding it valuable. She spoke about the village school, which she had funded quietly from her household allowance because she had not wished to trouble him with the request. He had not known there was a village school. She had built it in his name. He did not return to London that week, or the week after. The season continued without him, and the House of Lords managed its business in his absence, and the letters from his club piled up on the hall table unopened. He walked the estate with Vivian and Linton and saw it, truly saw it, for the first time. The tenant cottages on the eastern boundary had been rethatched and their gardens enclosed with new stone walls. The drainage ditches that had flooded every spring had been redirected according to a plan that Vivian had drawn herself, working from a surveyor's map she had commissioned with her own household funds. The village church had a new roof. The lane to the mill had been graveled. Every improvement bore the mark of her quiet, methodical attention. Not grand gestures, but the steady accumulation of small decisions made well, each one invisible on its own, together transforming an estate that had been merely functional into one that worked. Mrs. Crabb, who had served Welling Park for 19 years and who had watched the Duchess arrive as a bride and proceed to run the household with a competence that the housekeeper recognized immediately and respected deeply, observed the Duke's sudden interest in his own estate with the carefully neutral expression of a servant who has opinions she will never voice. She laid the tea tray in the morning room each afternoon and noted that the Duke now sat across from the Duchess rather than in his study. She noted that he asked questions about the household accounts that he had never previously shown interest in. She noted, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had been quietly loyal to her mistress for 3 years, that the Duchess answered these questions with patience and thoroughness, and not a trace of the resentment she would have been entirely entitled to feel. He sat in the evenings in the drawing room while she played Haydn, the same sonata she had discussed at Pelham's, and he listened with the concentrated attention of a man who understood he was hearing something he had almost lost the right to hear. She never told him whether she had heard the remark at Pelham's dinner. He never asked. It became the central mystery of their marriage, not a wound, but a sealed room, a door that both of them walked past without opening because what lay behind it mattered less than what they were building in front of it. He learned her, slowly, inadequately, with the stumbling earnestness of a man who had started 3 years late and knew it. He learned that she disliked sugared almonds, but would eat marchpane until the plate was bare. He learned that she rose early and walked the gardens before breakfast, not for exercise, but for the pleasure of seeing what had changed overnight. He learned that she wrote letters to her father every Thursday, and that the letters were long and detailed and funny, and that she had a talent for comic observation that she had never once deployed in his presence because he had never created the conditions in which she might. He learned her name. Not the name itself, he had always known the word, but the person it belonged to. The woman who read parliamentary reports and built village schools and remembered rose varieties and played Haydn with feeling and managed an estate with quiet brilliance and had married a man who had filed her away like a bill of lading and had responded to that filing not with complaint or confrontation, but with the steady, private, uncelebrated work of being excellent, regardless of whether anyone was watching. Lord Pelham, when he saw them together at a dinner the following spring, remarked to Lady Torrance that the Duke of Welling appeared to be a changed man. Lady Torrance, who had watched many men claim to change and very few actually do it, reserved judgment for a full 18 months before conceding, privately and only to Lord Pelham, that it appeared to be genuine. "He looks at her now," she said. "Before, he looked past her. There is a considerable difference." The son was born in the autumn of 1814. They named him Edward, after no one in particular, a name chosen for its own sake, because Vivian liked the sound of it, and Conrad, who had once treated such decisions as matters of lineage and strategy, found that he preferred her reason to any of his own. The boy grew up at Welling Park, where the gardens his mother had planted framed his childhood, and the village school she had built educated the tenants' children alongside the curate's sons. And he knew his parents as a pair, not as a duke and a duchess performing parallel lives, but as two people who sat together in the morning room and discussed the poor laws and the drainage and the Haydn and the marchpane. He did not learn about the remark at Lord Pelham's dinner until he was 47 years old. Lady Torrance, 93, sharp as glass, dying in her London townhouse with the same controlled precision she had brought to everything, asked to see him. She had outlived her husband, her children, her rivals, and most of her secrets, and she had decided that this particular secret had been kept long enough. "Your father said he had forgotten her name," Lady Torrance told him. She was propped against 4 pillows, her eyes bright and fierce, in a face that had surrendered everything except its intelligence. "He said it to me at Pelham's dinner, 30 seconds before she walked through the door. I have never told anyone. Your mother may or may not have heard it. I spent 40 years watching her face and I never determined the answer. It is the most remarkable thing I have ever witnessed, and I wish someone to know it before I am done." Edward sat beside her bed and thought of his mother, who had died 5 years earlier at Welling Park in the garden she had planted in the early morning before anyone else was awake, and of his father, who had followed her 7 months later with the bewildered grief of a man who had spent the second half of his life trying to deserve the first half's luck and was not certain he had succeeded. "Did she hear it?" Edward asked. Lady Torrance smiled. It was the last smile she gave anyone, and it was, Edward thought, the finest. "That," she said, "is entirely the point." The candles at Welling Park still burn in the evenings, long after the names have settled into the house like light into old wood. The morning room faces east, the gardens bloom, and the stories that matter most, the ones told not in ballrooms or drawing rooms, but in the small private spaces between two people who learned, slowly and imperfectly, to see each other. They arrive here, like a name remembered at exactly the wrong moment, whenever they are ready.